What if the person you called your husband was also your own brother? It sounds unthinkable, even monstrous. But history carries stories that challenge every limit of morality, and this is one of them. A woman, respected by some, feared by others, lived with a secret so dangerous that if it came to light, it could destroy her family, her reputation, and even her life. Her husband was not a stranger, not a distant cousin, but her very own brother, bound to her by blood, yet tied again in a forbidden marriage. In the 19th century, society placed honor at the center of everything. Families guarded their reputations with extreme care, communities relied on gossip to maintain control, and religion shaped ideas of right and wrong. In such a rigid world, even the smallest scandal could shatter lives. Yet here was a secret so heavy, so unnatural, that it went beyond scandal, it became an act of defiance against the natural order itself. Neighbors noticed something strange about her. She was stern, cold, and unlike other women of her time. She carried herself with authority, as though rules were meant for others, not for her. Whispers started. Why did she and her husband share such an odd connection? Why did their family seem closer, tighter, more secretive than anyone else's? No one dared to accuse them openly, but suspicion was always there, like a shadow in the room. And so the secret lived on. Behind closed doors, the bond between sister and brother grew darker. What might have begun as a secret they swore to protect slowly became the fuel for even greater acts of cruelty. Because once a line this sacred is crossed, what is left to stop someone from breaking every other boundary of morality? This is not a love story. It is not even a story of passion. It is a story of power, secrecy, and the terrifying truth that sometimes the greatest monsters are not strangers, they are family. Secrets have a way of eating through walls. No matter how carefully they're hidden, whispers eventually slip through the cracks. And in this case, the whispers were too disturbing to be ignored. A sister living as the wife of her own brother, how long could such a truth remain buried? People around them sensed that something was wrong. It was in the way they avoided certain questions, in the way their family closed itself off from others, in the way their bond seemed unnaturally intense. The 19th century was a time when society held strict boundaries. Marriage was sacred, family ties were sacred, and both were meant to remain separate. To break that boundary wasn't just taboo, it was considered a crime against both God and nature. If exposed, they risked everything: rejection from their community, legal consequences, and eternal condemnation. Yet, despite the dangers, they lived with their secret, year after year, building a life on top of a lie. For outsiders, it might have seemed like an ordinary marriage, though odd in ways they couldn't fully explain. But beneath the surface, the truth was corrosive. Their bond was not built on love in the pure sense, it was built on secrecy, fear, and the thrill of defying the rules everyone else lived by. And with each passing year, that defiance grew stronger, shaping the way they saw the world and the way they treated others. This forbidden relationship didn't just exist in isolation. It bled into every part of their lives. Decisions that should have been shaped by compassion or morality were instead driven by a shared darkness. Together, they began to cross lines most people would never imagine. And as their private bond turned into public cruelty, the consequences became impossible to hide. This was no ordinary scandal. It was the foundation of a family empire built on lies, fear, and pain. And once the mask began to crack, the horrifying reality of who they were, and what they had done, would leave their community in shock. The bond between brother and sister should have been one of trust, protection, and respect. But in this story, it became something far darker. What began as secrecy soon twisted into control, and what was once hidden desire turned into a partnership built on power. Their relationship wasn't just about living against the rules, it became a weapon they used to defy society itself. Behind closed doors, their forbidden bond gave them a sense of superiority. They were no longer just siblings, they were allies in secrecy, bound by a sin no one else dared to commit. And in that alliance, they began to believe they could escape every law, every moral code, every punishment. Together, they stepped deeper into cruelty, feeding each other's hunger for dominance. For those outside their home, the signs were subtle: strange behavior, whispered suspicions, and a family that always seemed one step removed from the rest of the community. But behind that thin wall of appearances, the truth was like a storm waiting to break. And once it did, it would not only expose their private sins, it would reveal the chilling extent of what they were capable of doing to others. This was no ordinary family. This was a union that blurred every line and shattered every boundary. And the darkness that grew from their forbidden bond would soon become something far more terrifying than a secret romance. It would become the fuel for a legacy of fear. Every secret carries a weight. At first, it is light enough to hide, easy enough to carry in silence. But as the years pass, that secret becomes heavier, darker, more dangerous. For this brother and sister, their forbidden bond was not only a secret, it was a curse. It shaped every choice they made, it colored the way they saw others, and it gave them a twisted sense of unity. They were bound not by love, not by loyalty, but by the knowledge that if one of them fell, the other would be dragged down with them. The people around them didn't know the full truth, but they could feel it. The tension in the air, the way neighbors whispered after seeing them together, the strange fear that seemed to follow their family, it all pointed to something unnatural. Rumors began to spread, and with each rumor, their mask of normalcy began to crack. The world they had built on lies was fragile, and it was only a matter of time before it collapsed. And when it did, the revelations shocked everyone. This was more than a forbidden marriage, it was the foundation of cruelty, manipulation, and crimes that would stain their names forever. Their bond, born from secrecy, became the weapon that turned them into something far worse than outcasts. This is not just the story of a family. It is the story of how a forbidden bond became a legacy of horror. And as we step deeper into their lives, we will uncover not only what they did, but why they believed they could get away with it. To truly understand why this story is so shocking, we must step back into the world of the early 19th century. It was a time when families were tightly bound by tradition, when religion shaped daily life, and when communities held each other accountable with an iron grip of morality. Society functioned on rules that were not just spoken but deeply ingrained. Marriage was sacred, blood ties were sacred, and neither could be mixed without provoking outrage. In rural towns, families were the backbone of survival. Everyone knew their neighbors, and reputation was currency. A whisper could destroy a household, a scandal could leave a family isolated, and shame could travel faster than the truth. For women, the expectations were even stricter: obedience, modesty, and silence. To step outside these roles was already risky, but to defy them completely, by uniting with one's own brother, was an act unthinkable to most people. Religion, too, stood as a towering presence. Preachers spoke of sin and punishment, of heaven and hell. The Bible was considered the ultimate authority on morality, and incest was viewed as a direct violation of God's law. In such an environment, even the suspicion of such a forbidden relationship was enough to stain a family's name forever. And yet, it was within this rigid, rule-bound society that the bond between this brother and sister took root. They did not simply break a taboo, they shattered the foundation upon which their world was built. Their secret existed in constant tension with the values around them, forcing them to create layers of lies, control, and intimidation to keep it hidden. This was not just a private choice. It was a rebellion against an entire system of beliefs, and it carried consequences that rippled far beyond their own household. To the outside world, they appeared as a strange but functioning couple. But beneath that surface, their very existence was an act of defiance against the moral code of their time. Every family carries secrets. Some are harmless, small lies told to protect pride or reputation. But the secret that lived inside this family was far from harmless. It was poisonous. A husband and wife to the world, but a brother and sister in truth. This was not a mistake of youth or a fleeting scandal, it was a lifelong deception that required constant silence, constant control, and constant fear of discovery. Behind closed doors, the two shared an understanding that no outsider could penetrate. Their entire household revolved around hiding the truth. Words were carefully chosen, stories rehearsed, and even the smallest slip could have meant exposure. They knew that if the truth came out, it would not only destroy their names but also unleash a storm of judgment, punishment, and hatred. And so, secrecy became their shield. But secrecy is never quiet. Neighbors noticed things they could not explain. Why did this couple seem different from others? Why did their family avoid gatherings, decline friendships, and keep to themselves? Whispers began to spread, at first quietly, then louder. Some called it strangeness. Others dared to call it sin. Yet without proof, all anyone could do was speculate. And the more they speculated, the more paranoid the family became. Inside the home, the pressure of living with such a lie twisted their bond even further. What might have once been love became dependency. They could not live without each other, but not because of devotion, because they were trapped. One exposed the other, one betrayed the other, and both would fall. This shared danger welded them together like iron, making their forbidden union stronger, but also more destructive. Their children, too, bore the shadow of this secret. They grew up in a house where silence ruled, where the truth was a ghost that haunted every corner. And in that silence, the forbidden bond of their parents became the seed of a legacy far darker than anyone in the community could have imagined. A secret can rot in silence, but when it festers too long, it often transforms into something far worse. For this family, the forbidden bond between brother and sister did not remain a private sin, it became the foundation of cruelty, manipulation, and violence that scarred countless lives around them. What began as secrecy inside their home slowly spilled outward, twisting into acts of inhumanity that shocked even hardened communities. Living outside the boundaries of morality, they began to believe they were untouchable. If they could break the sacred rule of blood and marriage without consequence, why should any other law matter? That mindset gave birth to their crimes. They preyed on the vulnerable, exploiting anyone who lacked power, especially African Americans during a time of systemic racism and injustice. Kidnapping, selling, and in some cases, even killing became part of their operations. The family house itself became a place of dread, whispered about as if it carried a curse. Neighbors began to notice the disappearances. People, especially free black men, women, and even children, were seen entering their orbit, but never returning. Rumors grew darker, of chained captives held in secret, of screams muffled behind locked doors, of graves dug in silence. These were not just whispers of immorality, they were stories of a reign of terror. What made their cruelty even more chilling was the unity with which they carried it out. Husband and wife in public, brother and sister in truth, they worked as a team, feeding each other's darkness. Their forbidden bond gave them a twisted loyalty, and that loyalty made them more dangerous than any single criminal acting alone. This was not merely about profit. It was about control, about dominance, about the thrill of bending human lives to their will. And as the years passed, their crimes became bolder, more violent, and impossible to ignore. The family secret had transformed into something much larger, a criminal empire. No empire of fear lasts forever. For years, this family thrived on secrecy, using silence and intimidation to keep their crimes buried. But the very weight of their actions became too heavy to conceal. Whispers, once ignored, began to grow into louder suspicions. Neighbors who had stayed quiet out of fear now began to talk more openly. Stories of missing people, strange behavior around the Cannon household, and odd nighttime activities spread through the town like wildfire. The cracks began not from outside authorities, but from within the community itself. Farmers, shopkeepers, and even children whispered about the family no one fully trusted. Some claimed they saw captives led into barns under cover of darkness. Others swore they heard cries carried by the wind. At first, such stories were dismissed as gossip, but over time, the consistency of the rumors became impossible to ignore. The turning point came when families of the missing refused to stay silent. Mothers, fathers, and friends who had lost loved ones began demanding answers. Their voices, once ignored, gained strength in numbers. What was once a private suspicion now became a public demand for truth. And in that rising tide of suspicion, the canon's carefully built world began to crumble. For the first time, fear shifted direction. No longer were people afraid of them, instead, the family began to fear the community closing in around them. Once whispers grew too loud, they reached the ears of men who could no longer ignore them, local sheriffs, magistrates, and eventually state authorities. At first, even the law hesitated. The family had cultivated an image of wealth and influence, and their property was guarded by an air of intimidation. But pressure from grieving families and the sheer number of disappearances forced the hand of justice. Officials could not look the other way any longer. Investigators began to quietly probe. Questions were asked about the sudden vanishing of free black men, women, and even children. Records were checked, testimonies collected, and soon, a chilling pattern emerged: many of the missing had last been seen near the canon's property. Witnesses stepped forward, some recalling wagons moving late at night, others remembering faces peering from behind shuttered windows. The family, once so confident in their silence, began to falter. They tried to intimidate witnesses, to bribe officials, even to spread counter-rumors. But the weight of evidence was slowly stacking against them. It wasn't a sudden storm that brought them down, it was a steady drip, like water carving into stone. Each new testimony, each unexplained disappearance, chipped away at their walls of secrecy. The very lies they had built their lives on now began to entangle them, making escape impossible. For the first time, the brother and sister who had lived above morality realized the net was tightening. Their empire of fear was being exposed, not by a single act of rebellion, but by the collective cry for justice echoing louder than their threats. When the whispers hardened into testimony and the suspicion turned into evidence, the law could wait no longer. A raid was ordered on the canon property, and what the authorities uncovered shocked even the most hardened men. The house and its surrounding land, once symbols of power and prosperity, revealed themselves as chambers of cruelty. Hidden rooms, shackles, and evidence of captivity were discovered. Items belonging to missing men, women, and children were found tucked away, silent witnesses to unspeakable crimes. The discovery was like ripping open a wound in the community. Neighbors who had long suspected foul play were horrified to see their darkest fears confirmed. The screams they had whispered about, the disappearances they had tried to ignore, all of it was real. This was no longer rumor, no longer imagination. It was cold, undeniable fact. Bodies, too, were said to have been uncovered, buried in shallow graves on the land. Each one told a story of suffering cut short, of lives stolen for profit and cruelty. For every victim found, there were countless others never accounted for, swallowed by the secrecy of years. The community that had once tiptoed around the family now turned against them with fury. The very people who had been too afraid to speak now demanded blood, demanded justice. The brother and sister could no longer hide behind their influence or their lies. The evidence was carved into the earth itself. For the first time, the mighty Cannon Empire stood exposed, not as a family of respectability, but as monsters who had used fear and blood to build their lives. And once the mask was torn away, there was no putting it back on. With the evidence laid bare, there was no escaping justice. The family that once ruled through silence and terror now found themselves in chains, marched before crowds that no longer feared them. Where once their presence inspired whispers and avoidance, now it provoked anger, curses, and the demand for their destruction. The mighty facade of wealth and respectability had shattered, leaving only the truth, a brother and sister whose love had become a weapon of cruelty. The trial was more than a legal proceeding, it was a public reckoning. Witnesses came forward, each testimony painting a picture more horrifying than the last. Former accomplices turned against them to save themselves, while grieving families stood in court to demand answers. The evidence was overwhelming: personal belongings of the victims, hidden chambers, and the chilling consistency of the disappearances. No argument could save them, no influence could protect them. What had once been their strength, the secrecy of their forbidden bond, now stood as the ultimate symbol of their corruption. Their twisted unity, once their shield, became their doom. The verdict was inevitable. Guilty, not just of crime, but of living as monsters among men. The community, once paralyzed by fear, felt a collective release as justice was delivered. The Cannon name, once spoken with caution, became a warning, a reminder of how power and secrecy can breed horrors. And so, the downfall was complete. Not with a quiet disappearance into obscurity, but with the full weight of justice dragging their names into infamy forever. When the dust settled and the trial ended, the legacy of this family did not vanish with their punishment, it lingered, like a scar etched into the memory of an entire region. Communities that had once whispered in fear now spoke their names openly, not with respect, but with disgust and horror. Parents told their children the story as a warning, of what happens when greed, secrecy, and forbidden desires are allowed to rule over morality. The land itself seemed haunted by their crimes. Neighbors avoided passing too close to the Cannon property, fearful of the shadows that seemed to cling to it. Even after the house was eventually abandoned, its ruins stood as a grim reminder of the lives lost within its walls. People spoke of hearing cries in the night, of uneasy silences whenever the family's name was mentioned, as if the echoes of their cruelty refused to die. But their story was not just local gossip, it became part of the wider American narrative. Historians pointed to their crimes as a stark example of how slavery, human trafficking, and unchecked power corroded communities. Patty Cannon's name, in particular, grew infamous, etched into the annals of true crime history as one of the most feared women of early America. She became a symbol of cruelty that surpassed gender, proving that evil wears many faces. What made their legacy most terrifying was not simply the number of victims, but the intimacy of their bond. A brother and sister who became husband and wife, united not by love, but by darkness. That forbidden unity amplified their power and ensured their cruelty endured for years. To the public, their story became more than a tale of murder, it was a cautionary legend, retold to remind generations that evil often hides behind familiar faces, and that silence in the face of wrongdoing only feeds the monster. Their downfall was justice, but their memory remains a nightmare, a warning that history must never allow to repeat. Long after the Cannon family's reign ended, their story continued to echo through time. For decades, newspapers, pamphlets, and local storytellers recounted the nightmare with a mix of fascination and horror. In taverns, around firesides, and later in classrooms, their names were invoked as a grim reminder of how far human cruelty could descend. To many, they became less like real people and more like legends, monsters whose existence blurred the line between history and folklore. Writers seized upon their story, some exaggerating details, others grounding them in fact. Their crimes became cautionary tales woven into American culture, warnings against unchecked power, incestuous secrecy, and the silence of communities that allow evil to thrive. Even as centuries passed, their names never fully faded. They appeared in history books, true crime collections, and even ghost stories whispered by those who lived near the ruins of their old property. What haunted people most was not just the brutality, but the intimacy of the betrayal. Families are meant to protect, nurture, and preserve life, yet the Cannons twisted that bond into something predatory and grotesque. That betrayal struck at the very heart of what people hold sacred, making their crimes unforgettable. In the modern age, researchers and historians revisit their story not only to understand their crimes, but to grapple with broader truths, how institutions failed to stop them, how fear silenced the innocent, and how power shields evil until collective courage rises to confront it. The Cannons' downfall, while a triumph of justice, remains a haunting case study in how communities can be complicit through silence, and how breaking that silence can finally end a reign of terror. Their story did not vanish with their deaths. It became immortal, not in glory, but in infamy, etched into America's memory as a chilling echo that warns every new generation of the dangers of silence, secrecy, and unchecked power. Every story of cruelty leaves behind a lesson, and the tale of the cannons is no different. On the surface, it may seem like just another grim chapter in early American history, a story of greed, forbidden love, and unimaginable violence. But when we look deeper, it becomes a mirror, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and society. The first lesson is silence. For years, neighbors suspected something, yet they looked away. Fear kept their voices low, and that silence gave the cannons power. Evil thrives not because it is stronger, but because good people hesitate to act. This truth echoes far beyond their time, reminding us that whenever communities ignore injustice, they become part of it. The second lesson is secrecy. The forbidden bond between brother and sister was not only a personal sin, it became the foundation of their cruelty. Their need to protect their secret at all costs led them to destroy countless lives. It shows how private corruption, if hidden long enough, can spill outward until it poisons entire communities. Finally, their story warns us about power without accountability. The cannons had influence, property, and fear on their side, and for years it shielded them from consequences. But power built on lies and cruelty will always collapse, because truth, once revealed, is stronger than fear. So what does this mean for us today? It means remembering that silence enables cruelty, secrecy corrodes trust, and unchecked power corrupts absolutely. The cannon's legacy is not just a tale of horror, it is a warning carved into history, urging us to stay vigilant, to speak out against injustice, and to never let fear keep us quiet. Their downfall was their punishment, but their story endures as a lesson. Evil may rise in the shadows, but it cannot survive the light of truth. Every story of cruelty leaves behind a lesson, and the tale of the cannons is no different. On the surface, it may seem like just another grim chapter in early American history, a story of greed, forbidden love, and unimaginable violence. But when we look deeper, it becomes a mirror, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and society. The first lesson is silence. For years, neighbors suspected something, yet they looked away. Fear kept their voices low, and that silence gave the cannons power. Evil thrives not because it is stronger, but because good people hesitate to act. This truth echoes far beyond their time, reminding us that whenever communities ignore injustice, they become part of it. The second lesson is secrecy. The forbidden bond between brother and sister was not only a personal sin, it became the foundation of their cruelty. Their need to protect their secret at all costs led them to destroy countless lives. It shows how private corruption, if hidden long enough, can spill outward until it poisons entire communities. Finally, their story warns us about power without accountability. The cannons had influence, property, and fear on their side, and for years it shielded them from consequences. But power built on lies and cruelty will always collapse, because truth, once revealed, is stronger than fear. So what does this mean for us today? It means remembering that silence enables cruelty, secrecy corrodes trust, and unchecked power corrupts absolutely. The cannon's legacy is not just a tale of horror, it is a warning carved into history, urging us to stay vigilant, to speak out against injustice, and to never let fear keep us quiet. Their downfall was their punishment, but their story endures as a lesson. Evil may rise in the shadows, but it cannot survive the light of truth.